US government has decided to take a 10% stake in Intel. Is this good? Is this something to be worried about? Is this something NVIDIA and the other chip makers should be worried about? How did this come to happen, right? And has this ever happened before? We're going to get into all of this. I think this is super interesting, actually, to think that the government should intervene into, let's be honest, Intel was a pretty struggling business, which is a pretty strange outcome, to be honest. You know, like even right near the dot-com bubble, Intel was sort of the go-to hardware manufacturer that made the dot-com boom possible, right? They were making chips for Apple, and then Apple moved away. They're still making chips for a lot of personal computing products, but they were left in the dust by NVIDIA and AMD and all these other chip makers, so much so that Intel really needed a cash injection and a bit of a bailout from the US government, which I think might be for the best. I think Intel has a tremendous infrastructure. Intel has, you know, like a lot of value that it's able to offer to not just the US government, but to the US economy. Intel is setting up new plants, and it's going to be creating jobs in these chip making and chip fabrication plants. They're going to be creating it's going to be creating American jobs. So it makes sense for the US government to have a stake in Intel. But a 10% stake is significant. That, I think, makes the US government the largest investor in Intel. What gives the US government the right? Well, I'll tell you what gives the US government the right. In the Biden era, as per the CHIPS Act, grants in funding in the form of grants were slated to be given to Intel. Now the grant has simply been transformed into an investment, into an equity deal, where the US government comes in and is able to own 10% of Intel. Now, there's a reason nationalized corporations are not the norm in the US or in any free market, is that anything nationalized gets a lot of subsidies, and there isn't that pressure to survive in the free market and outcompete all your rivals to come up with a product that is the best product out there. And to be honest, I think the US has a go-to chip maker. NVIDIA is an incredible chip maker, so it's not an industry that needs protection. It's specifically Intel that needs protection. The other thing that I would be worried about if I was Intel, if I was NVIDIA, if I was AMD, if I was NVIDIA, is, does this bring Intel sort of to the top of the line when it comes to, or the top of the queue, the front of the queue when it comes to regulatory favoritism with the US government? I mean, the US government, much like any investor, is going to want a return on its investment, right? It's going to want Intel to outperform its competitors, and therefore it's going to want Intel's stock price to go up, because that's how you get a payoff for your equity investment. And you could argue that it would be in the best interest of the US government to sort of make regulatory changes that would benefit Intel, right? It's a little tricky. It's a little convoluted. I mean, what if the US government decided that, hey, the export controls that apply for NVIDIA are going to be a lot more lax for Intel? So Intel, and this is all hypothetical, I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but what if Intel gets much more favorable trade terms with other countries that NVIDIA does? Is that fair? No, but that is definitely something that the government is able to do. All in all, I think this is something that this is territory that we should tread very carefully. But this is not to say that stuff like this hasn't happened before in the past, right? I mean, in terms of during the Second World War, critical industries that needed to be protected, like the steel industry, like the railroads, firms, a lot of companies in the railroads industry were nationalized because they needed government protection. I think following the housing collapse, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, the two lending companies, were also nationalized for the most part. I mean, they have this weird structure where they're still able to trade privately and they're owned privately, but they're really in some ways controlled by the government. So that nationalization did happen following the 2008 financial crisis. In fact, a lot of nationalization to various degrees happened following the 2008 financial crisis. AIG, a lot of companies, a lot of banks got bailed out by the government, and the government did take somewhat of controlling stake in these banks that got bailed out. So if a business is deemed so critical to the economy that the economy cannot operate without it, it actually makes a lot of sense for the US government to come in, intervene, and give them a bailout, right? It can be in the form of a grant, or in the case of Intel with a 10% investment, it can be an equity investment. And look, you might be saying like all of this money is money of the people. This is taxpayer money, and like we're investing taxpayer money into a company. So much like when we put our money into a retirement account, we expect to see returns. And in that sense, there is some rationale in the government playing favorites with Intel and giving it the air it needs under its wings to soar high above NVIDIA and AMD. Although I think that's definitely not going to happen. I think if you really look into what it takes to set up a chip fabrication pipeline, and the amount of time and expertise and trial and error and R&D that goes into not just setting up a pipeline for chip fabrication, but also getting industry-wide adoption for it, I think NVIDIA has nothing to worry about. NVIDIA's moat is not just in the fact that they make the best hardware in the world. NVIDIA's moat is that they have some of the strongest supply chain relationships with TSMC. NVIDIA's moat is in the fact that they have arguably the most widely adopted software framework that lets people manipulate GPUs in its CUDA framework. I don't think research laboratories, I don't think huge software and machine learning teams operating in these big tech companies are going to just switch over to the Intel software stack because their unproven chips are going to maybe offer more of a competitive edge, or even maybe offer a lower pricing point than the NVIDIA chips. I do think that this does put a bit of pricing pressure on NVIDIA. I do think that this is yet another thing that NVIDIA will now need to be worried about. I mean, in China, obviously, Huawei is making a pretty strong push to building its chips in-house. And if NVIDIA loses the Chinese market due to export controls or due to, like natively developed chips, that's definitely going to eat into its top line revenue. If there's pricing pressures from protected companies like Intel who are trying to eat into NVIDIA's market share domestically, there's definitely going to be pricing pressure there. So maybe all of this is good. Maybe all of this is going to be for the best, because NVIDIA certainly does not have a lack of cash or a lack of capital injection. Every bit of venture money that flows into anything AI these days is eventually going to trickle down to NVIDIA, because AI is built on top of NVIDIA GPUs. Anyway, I think this is going to be interesting, something to definitely keep your eyes on. Thank you for tagging along. I'll see you in the next video.